Cuba's foreign minister is in St Lucia a day ahead of his meeting with CARICOM. A row over freedom of information shakes Trinidad and Tobago. We ask what is behind it. And a special commission to be created to address the migration issue on the southern border of Mexico. Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. We begin in Brazil. Opposition parties want to form a parliamentary commission to investigate the Justice Minister Sergio Moro. This as fresh reports implicate another judge who allegedly colluded with Moro and prosecutor Deltan Dallagnol in a plot against former President Lula da Silva. In leaked private conversations, Moro refers to Judge Luis Fuchs as a co-conspirator in the plot. All this as representatives from 5 progressive movements, including the Workers' Party and the Socialism and Freedom Party, will ask for a commission to be established in order to investigate Moro's role as a judge in the Lava Jato investigation. The move comes after the release of messages sent between Moro and the prosecutor, Deltan Dallagnol, which revealed the political interests of both in pursuing the former president, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, and preventing his candidacy for office in 2018. The opposition bench also announced that it would block all votes in Congress until the commission is established. Our correspondent in Brazil, Brian Mier, has more.
Last night, The Intercept released a new set of conversations between Lava Jato task force members Sergio Moro, who's now serving as far-right President Jair Bolsonaro's Justice Minister, and prosecutor Deltan Dallagnol. Now, these new conversations released 2 pieces of important information which further advance the argument that the entire purpose of the operation was to prevent the PT party from winning the 2018 presidential elections. In these conversations, Dallagnol and Moro talk about how a Supreme Court minister named Luis Fuchs was working in collaboration with them. Moro even says, "In Fuchs we trust." Now, it's important to note that Fuchs both denied a habeas corpus for Lula last year, and he also issued an order barring Lula from speaking to the press during the election season. Now, this is very unusual because in Brazil, the press interviews mass murderers and organized crime heads inside of jail all the time. The other revelation is that they were also communicating with the Americans. Now, the fact that the Department of Justice has been a partner in Operation Lava Jato has been a matter of public record from day one. You can see on their own website them talking about it. But the problem is that in 1997, Brazil signed a treaty for mutual legal cooperation between Brazil and the United States, which has a clear set of guidelines, and it specifies that all communications between the 2 governments have to be centralized. It specifies that in Brazil, these communications have to be centralized through the Federal Ministry of Justice. So if informal communications were going on between Sergio Moro's Lava Jato task force and the U.S. Department of Justice, this is a crime in Brazil, which should result in immediately throwing out the conviction of Lula.
That was our correspondent Brian Mier with that report. The Cuban Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, has met St Lucia Prime Minister Allen Chastanet as he continues his tour of Caribbean nations. On Wednesday, Rodriguez and Chastanet reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening relations between their countries. In February of this year, St Lucia marked 40 years of independence, and Cuba was among the first countries to establish diplomatic ties with the newly independent St Lucia in 1979. St Lucia has also recently signed cooperative agreements with Cuba in the areas of agriculture and education. On Friday, Rodriguez will preside over the Cuban delegation that will participate in the 6th CARICOM Cuba ministerial meeting to be held in Guyana. The Cuban foreign minister's first stop on Tuesday was in Trinidad and Tobago, where he held talks with Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley and his foreign minister Dennis Moses. All parties reaffirmed the good status of bilateral relations and historical bonds of friendship that unite both countries. Rodriguez will also visit Barbados. The tour of Caribbean countries will last until June 18th. Our correspondent Alison Kentish has the details.
Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla ended his two-day visit to St Lucia on Thursday. It's part of his Caribbean tour, which included official visits to Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana and Barbados. Now in St Lucia, he met with Prime Minister Allen Chastanet and Minister with Responsibility for Foreign Affairs, Honorable Sarah Flood-Bobre. And according to the office of St Lucia's Prime Minister, the discussions focused on areas of mutual concern and benefit, including healthcare, agriculture, and of course, education. Both parties said the visit builds on the strong ties between St. Lucia and Cuba and reaffirms the commitment to work together. St. Lucia is celebrating a year-long 40th anniversary of independence, and Cuba was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with a newly independent St. Lucia in 1979. Alison Kentish, Telesur, St. Lucia.
Haitian President Jovenel Moïse says he will not bow to demands of protesters and resign amid allegations of embezzlement of funds linked to the Petro-Caribbean oil initiative. The spokesperson for the head of state, Charlotte Jacqueline Jr., said that Moïse had done everything to ensure there was an investigation into the corruption scandal. That probe concluded that nearly $2 billion from the program was misused and that Moïse's company received a cash advance nearly 2 months before a road contract was signed. Meanwhile, Haiti's government has condemned the attack on the French embassy during recent protests. The situation in Haiti remains tense following deadly protests by thousands of citizens demanding for the resignation of President Jovenel Moïse. In the capital, Port-au-Prince and other cities, work and economic activities remain paralyzed after last weekend's protests. 4 people have been killed so far since Sunday. Protesters have vowed to continue with the protests until their demands are met. June has been declared the month of Afro-Peruvian culture. It's an opportunity to discover and promote one of Peru's most hidden treasures.
In the Street of the Holy Spirit. That's the title of this play about the lives of African slaves and their struggle for freedom.
They don't tell us about this at school. They don't say anything about Afro-Peruvians being such an active part of the history and growth of this country. So it's very important to talk about it, and even better if it is in such an educational form as the theater.
¿Qué más si es a través de una forma tan didáctica como es el teatro?
The Afro-Peruvian community has played a prominent part in art and music. Their traditions have gained more and more recognition, like this black music, where the percussion box is the key instrument.
We give it a bit of a push, add harmony, make it full of joy, which we need to reach more people. We are talking whole of a tradition that came from Africa. But the percussion box is ours. It's pure Peruvian.
For black activists, declaring June the month of Afro-Peruvian culture is an opportunity to promote the community's identity even more. But they say this is still not enough, because they say black Peruvians still face serious discrimination. For example, at university, where only 10% manage to get a degree.
Only 1 in 10 finishes university, only 1. And that one will have a really hard time finding a job, because even if you have the same qualities and the same qualification as anyone else, but then it comes to the interview, they look at your skin color, and that is what decides who gets the job.
According to the census in 2017, 3.6% of the Peruvian population is black, and they are one of the most vulnerable sectors. 1/3 earn less than the minimum wage, and live in poverty.
We'll take a short break now. Join us in a few. Welcome back. Guyanese are no doubt anxiously awaiting the Caribbean Court of Justice ruling on the country's no-confidence motion on June 18th. After some delay, the court has set the tentative date to deliver judgment on the matter, which could see the country returning to the polls. Following last December's passage of the no-confidence motion against the government, the coalition administration challenged the validity of the motion in the High Court. However, in January, the acting Chief Justice upheld the passage of the motion, ruling that it was validly passed with the 33 majority. This decision was then appealed by government. In March, the appeal court ruled that 34 votes were needed to pass the motion. The CCJ will finally determine these matters. The former president of Panama, Ricardo Martinelli, has been under house arrest as he awaits trial for allegedly spying on more than 150 people, including journalists and opposition figures during his presidency. 67-year-old Martinelli had been in prison ahead of his trial since his extradition from the United States to Panama a year ago. If found guilty, he could face up to 21 years in prison. Moving now to Colombia, where we have a special report from our correspondent about the worsening situation in rural communities as residents are forced to leave due to violence.
Colombia's Ombudsman's office has issued an alert regarding the massive forced internal displacements throughout the country.
The Nariño department accounts for 43% of overall displacements, 3,540 people. This is evidence that forced displacements continues, and we are worried about the lack of guarantees to protect the rights of the population.
For Marco Romero, director of the Human Rights and Displacement Consultancy, CODES, the figure is only a small fraction, which shows how deep the armed conflict goes in Colombia.
People are facing expulsion from their territories, and others dare to speak about ethnic cleansing. There's an obvious strategic interest in those territories and historically a lack of protection.
The Colombian departments demonstrating the largest figures of forced displacements are the same ones which have seen murders of social leaders. For several people living in the rural territories, it shows a clear interest behind the humanitarian situation.
This is a geographical war. They want to complete large economic projects, but us, indigenous people, are settled in the areas that they are interested in. These areas, such as Chocó and the Pacific, have resources that they want to exploit. It's not just about drug trafficking routes. They want to clear those territories to start mega projects like that Atrato Truandó, Interoceanic Canal, Tribuga Gulf, and railways for the Pacific.
While many are being forced to leave, others are being confined, and the figures are growing. 12,773 people have been affected by this situation. All of them are part of ethnic groups and communities which are still waiting for the social investments which were promised by the government.
The grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo revealed the identity of grandchild number 130, who disappeared during the last dictatorship in Argentina. Javier Matias recognized that he had recovered his identity thanks to DNA tests through this association. Our correspondent in Buenos Aires, Edgardo Esteban, has more.
It's a day to celebrate amidst the challenge currently experienced in Argentina. We are at the headquarters of the Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo organization, and as you can see, the room is packed. The grandmothers have released the identity of grandchild number 130, Matias Javier Millacuch de Rux, son of Elena and Javier Matias, who disappeared from Buenos Aires in December 1977. It's an emotional moment for Matias' relative, who have spent 40 years looking for him. Matias was willing to be a part of this conference led by the organization's president, Estela Carlotto. It's a moment to reflect and a time to call on the community to keep searching for more details about his parents. For 42 years, these women with white handkerchiefs have struggled for justice.
In Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has announced the creation of a special commission to address the migration issue on the southern border. This is in compliance with the agreement signed with the United States that demands Mexico reduce the number of people who seek to cross the border without documents.
The Mexican president recognized that to reduce the flow of migrants in less than 3 months is a great challenge. He also presented the members of the special commission that will handle this phenomenon on the southern border of Mexico.
It is by fulfilling the needs that cause people to leave their countries. This is not solved with the use of the force.
Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard will coordinate the work of Commission to fulfill the commitments included in the agreement signed with Washington.
This is not what the United States wanted. It was their main plan. This is a proposal that we put on the table, and we have time to demonstrate that it can work.
The implementation of the governmental strategy will include the deployment of up to 6,000 members of the National Guard, who will, among other things, be in charge of registering those who come in the country. López Obrador also ordered to speed up the application of social and employment programs in the southern states. Meanwhile, the U.S. president insists that he has negotiated an agreement with Mexico, which he has failed to disclose so far.
Here's the agreement. It's a very simple agreement. This is one page. This is one page of a very long and very good agreement for both Mexico and the United States.
Meanwhile, south of Mexico, uncertainty grows among those who flee poverty and violence in their countries, like Guatemala, El Salvador, and especially Honduras.
We want the United States and Mexican government to listen to us and give us the opportunity to pass, and I do not agree with the Army and Marines acting this way.
It is very dangerous because the migration police is roaming around, and if you leave your home, they will catch you and send you back to your country.
The Special Commission to address the immigration phenomenon will also work in the creation of a regional system that includes the governments of the countries that, just in the first 5 months of 2019, expelled between 350,000 and 400,000 people.
Workers at Chile's giant copper mining company Codelco are to go on strike this Friday. The miners voted to down tools at the Chuquicamata copper mine after rejecting the company's bonus offer. They want better wages and a decent health and pension plan. Codelco is the world's biggest exporter of copper, but its business faces risks from the United States trade war on China. We'll take a short break now. Don't go away. Welcome back. Oil prices have risen after an alleged attack on 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Fire broke out on the ships from Japan and Norway after explosions were reported. The crews abandoned the ship and were rescued by Iranian vessels. A government official in Tehran said Iran had nothing to do with the explosions. He said someone is trying to destabilize relations between Iran and the international community. UK Home Secretary Sajid Javid has signed a request for journalist and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to be extradited to the US, where he faces an 18-count indictment, which includes charges under the Espionage Act. Our correspondent in London, Pablo Navarrete, has more.
The British Minister of the Interior, or Home Secretary as he's called here, Sajid Javid, has announced on the BBC radio show, the Today programme, that he had signed what he called was an extradition order by the US government of Donald Trump to have the WikiLeaks founder and journalist Julian Assange extradited to the US to face 18 charges, including espionage, some that fall under the Espionage Act. Now, speaking to the Today programme this morning, local time, he said that he's rightly behind bars, referring to Assange. There's an extradition request from the US that is before the courts tomorrow, but yesterday I signed the extradition order and certified it, and that will be going in front of the courts tomorrow. Now, Javid made an error, in fact, by saying it was an order. It was a request as per British extradition process, and that will be seen tomorrow at the Westminster Magistrates. Now, it would be expected that Julian Assange would come in via video link, although at the previous Westminster Magistrates hearing to look at the extradition request, he was too ill to take part. Now, his father has been in London this week, and I spoke to him earlier this week, and he just before he went to Belmarsh to visit his son for the first time. Now, there have been grave concerns over Assange's health, his deteriorating health, and there's still speculation as to whether he will be in fact able to even attend this time via video link, although there is talk of the hearing being moved to Belmarsh prison if that is the case. Now, as we know, Julian Assange has been in Belmarsh prison in the south of London since mid-April, when he was expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy in London by the Lenin Moreno government after they revoked the political asylum status that he had been given under the Rafael Correa government.
Earlier this week, Pablo Navarrete interviewed the father of Julian Assange, John Shipton. In this clip, he assessed the role of the Australian government through this legal process and says that members of the media have begun to wake up to the dangers they face in their work.
But in my view, the Australian government has done absolutely nothing to assist Julian, despite the breaking of convention, the manipulation of protocol, the refusal of the Swedish to advance the case, even under their own regulations, that the Australian government, in doing nothing over 9 years, becomes complicit in the persecution of Julian. There was a change in the level of support worldwide as journalists begun to realise that the dangers that Julian was now in would affect their work and would affect them. So there's been some change.
The government of Mali has fired the governor of the region in which an attack left scores of people dead. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta said the governor of the Mopti region has been relieved of his duties. Meanwhile, the government has also announced that the death toll has been revised from an estimated 95 to 35. Prime Minister Boubou Cisse said the new figure comes after an extensive verification process was done.
At this time, 35 people dead have been identified, among them 24 children, kids who have been shot in the back. So it's important that nobody forgets it.
Women medical workers in Switzerland are holding a strike against workplace discrimination and sexual harassment. Female nurses and medical students will be joining a nationwide strike for women's rights on Friday. The same strike was last held in 1991, leading to the passing of the Gender Equality Act. But nearly 30 years later, Swiss women are still earning less than men and face challenges such as dismissal over pregnancy, marital status, and gender. The activists say that Switzerland still lags behind other developed economies when it comes to workplace gender equality.
The 80% of the workers in our profession are women, and still, when you look at who is in charge in the hierarchy, it is mainly men, and I think this is fundamentally unfair, and this is directly linked to the fact that when women have their first child, they reduce their working hours to be able to take care of them. All the more than as we work in staggered hours, it is really difficult to find suitable childcare, and so obviously, when you work part-time, it is very difficult to make your way up in the hierarchy.
Cricket World Cup fans are enduring more frustration as the start of the match between India and New Zealand at Trent Bridge has been delayed by rain. While both teams are hoping to extend their 100% winning record in the competition, it doesn't seem as though play would be possible. An abandonment would be the fourth in this Cricket World Cup. The previous highest number of abandoned games in a World Cup was 2 in 1992 and 2003. We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Through English, I'm Doris Polo. Thank you for watching.